Emily stared at the college brochures scattered across her small desk, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. The glossy pages showed images of lecture halls, laboratories, and students in white coats, everything she had been dreaming about since she first fell in love with biology in her sophomore year. Now, as a senior in high school, the decision that would change everything was finally within reach. Medicine had always called to her in ways she struggled to explain to others. While her classmates saw biology as just another required course, Emily found herself captivated by the intricate dance of cells, the elegant complexity of organ systems, the miraculous way the human body could heal itself. The textbooks that made others groan filled her with wonder. She could see it so clearly herself in a white coat, stethoscope draped around her neck, bringing comfort to the sick and answers to the worried. The vision felt both distant and achingly close, like something she could almost touch if she just reached far enough. But dreams, Emily had learned early, were luxuries her family couldn't afford. The Dawson household operated on a rhythm of necessity that had been established long before Emily could remember questioning it. Her parents, Stephanie and Wyatt, had both clawed their way up from poverty through sheer determination and endless work. Wyatt's job at the correctional facility meant unpredictable hours and the kind of stress that followed him home, settling into the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. Stephanie spent her days behind the teller window at First National Bank, counting other people's money and forcing smiles for customers who sometimes treated her as if she were invisible. The real work, though, began after their day jobs ended. The Dawsons owned a small commercial cleaning business, if it could even be called that. Really, it was just them with a van full of supplies, moving from office building to office building in the evenings, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans to make ends meet. The mortgage on their modest 3-bedroom house demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice had become the family's defining characteristic. Everything changed when Emily turned 10 and the twins arrived. She still remembered the morning her mother came home from the hospital, exhausted and overwhelmed, carrying 2 small bundles that would reshape Emily's entire world. Marcus and Mason were identical in every way except for a small birthmark on Marcus's left shoulder, a detail Emily memorized immediately, knowing she would be the one to tell them apart when others couldn't. From that first day, Emily became something more than an older sister. She became a third parent. While other 10-year-olds were learning to ride bikes or having sleepovers, Emily was learning to warm bottles and change diapers. She discovered she had a natural instinct for soothing crying babies, a patience that seemed to come from nowhere when the twins were fussy. By the time she was 12, she could prepare their meals, give them baths, and put them to bed as efficiently as any adult. Her parents never asked her to take on these responsibilities. They simply assumed she would, and Emily, being the compliant child she was, never questioned it. Wyatt would come home from his shifts at the correctional facility drained and needing to sleep before their evening cleaning jobs. Stephanie would arrive from the bank already calculating how many offices they needed to clean that night to stay ahead of their bills. Emily learned to read the exhaustion in their faces and wordlessly stepped in to fill the gaps. The cleaning jobs became family affairs by necessity. Loading sleeping toddlers into car seats at 8 o'clock at night became routine. Emily would spread blankets in empty office break rooms while her parents worked, keeping the twins quiet and entertained. As she got older, she graduated from babysitter to assistant, learning to operate industrial vacuum cleaners and mix cleaning solutions while the twins napped in portable cribs. Other families had movie nights and weekend trips. The Dawsons had office buildings and the constant smell of disinfectant. Emily's high school years blurred together in a haze of obligation and missed opportunities. While her classmates joined clubs, went to football games, and spent hours on the phone with friends, Emily hurried home each afternoon to relieve her exhausted mother. She became expert at preparing simple dinners, helping with homework she could do in her sleep, and mediating the inevitable conflicts between 2 energetic boys. The invitations to hang out after school became fewer and fewer as friends learned that Emily would always decline. Birthday parties happened without her. School dances came and went while she stayed home with Marcus and Mason, playing board games and making popcorn for movie nights that only she seemed to understand weren't optional. Her grades remained excellent, partly because she was naturally bright, but mostly because homework provided her only escape. While the twins played in their room, Emily would lose herself in chemistry equations and historical timelines, subjects that transported her briefly away from the weight of constant responsibility. Her parents never asked about her dreams. Wyatt and Stephanie had grown up in families where survival was the only goal, where thinking beyond the next paycheck was a dangerous luxury. It was Mrs. Bennett, her AP biology teacher, who first suggested that Emily had the potential for medical school. During one of their after-school study sessions, Mrs. Bennett had watched Emily explain cellular respiration to a struggling classmate with such clarity and passion that she couldn't ignore the obvious calling. "Have you ever thought about becoming a doctor?" Mrs. Bennett asked one afternoon as Emily was packing up her textbooks. "You have the mind for it, and more importantly, you have the heart for it." Emily had laughed off the suggestion initially. Doctors came from wealthy families, didn't they? They had parents who could afford medical school tuition and years of study without income. But Mrs. Bennett persisted, providing information about scholarships, pre-med programs, and financial aid options that Emily had never known existed. "Intelligence and compassion can't be bought," Mrs. Bennett told her. "And you have both in abundance. Don't let circumstances convince you that your dreams are impossible." Now, surrounded by college brochures and application deadlines, Emily felt the weight of possibility pressing against the boundaries of her carefully circumscribed life. But telling her parents about these dreams felt like planning a revolution in a house built on routine and resignation. Emily had never been the difficult child. She had never challenged their authority or questioned the sacrifices they had asked her to make. How could she suddenly announce that she wanted something more than the life they had mapped out for her? She folded one of the brochures carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, next to textbooks that promised to teach her about molecular biology and organic chemistry. Outside her bedroom window, she could hear Marcus and Mason playing in the backyard, their laughter mixing with the distant sounds of neighborhood life that she rarely got to experience. Tomorrow, her parents would expect her to come home from school and immediately take over childcare duties while they prepared for another evening of cleaning office buildings. They would assume, as they always had, that Emily's time belonged to them, that her energy and intelligence were resources to be deployed in service of family survival. But tonight, for just a few hours, Emily allowed herself to imagine walking across a graduation stage in a cap and gown, accepting a medical degree that represented years of sacrifice and study. She imagined her first patient, her first successful treatment, her first moment of knowing that all the missed parties and declined invitations had led to something meaningful. The dream felt both impossible and inevitable, like a destination she was meant to reach but might never find the courage to pursue. In a few months, she would graduate from high school and face the choice between safety and possibility, between the life her parents expected and the future she had begun to envision for herself. Emily opened another college brochure, studying the faces of students who looked confident and purposeful, who seemed to believe that their dreams were worth pursuing regardless of the obstacles. She wondered if she would ever have the courage to join them, or if the weight of family obligation would keep her forever tethered to a life that felt too small for the ambitions growing inside her. The application deadlines were approaching fast, and soon Emily would have to decide whether she was brave enough to reach for something more than survival, something that looked remarkably like the life she had always dreamed of living. Emily had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in her head, imagining different scenarios, different reactions, different outcomes. In her more optimistic moments, she pictured her mother's face lighting up with pride, maybe even tears of joy. She imagined her father setting down his newspaper and asking thoughtful questions about her plans. She had even dared to hope they might celebrate together as a family. The reality was devastatingly different. The first time she mentioned her medical school aspirations, Emily was helping her mother gather cleaning supplies from the garage. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, where bottles of industrial cleaner and boxes of rubber gloves were stacked like monuments to their endless cycle of work. "Mom," Emily began carefully, her voice barely audible over the sound of Stephanie rummaging through a box of cleaning rags. "I've been thinking about going to college to study medicine." Stephanie's hands never stopped moving. She pulled out a stack of microfiber cloths and added them to the growing pile of supplies. "Oh, yeah?" The response came automatically, without interest, as if Emily had commented on the weather. Emily waited for more a follow-up question, a sign of curiosity, anything that might indicate her mother had actually heard what she'd said. Instead, Stephanie glanced at her watch and sighed. "Can you get the vacuum ready? We need to leave for the Morrison building in 20 minutes. And you know how Mr. Peterson gets when we're even a minute late." The dismissal stung more than Emily had expected. She stood there for a moment, watching her mother efficiently organize their evening's arsenal of cleaning products, and realized that her dreams had been reduced to background noise in the symphony of their survival. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She decided to try again during dinner, when the family was gathered together, and distractions would be minimal. She spent the day planning her approach, choosing her words carefully, building up the courage to make herself heard. That evening, the Dawson family sat around their small kitchen table, a scene that would have looked perfectly normal to any outsider. Wyatt had claimed his usual spot facing the television, even though it was turned off, and spread the local newspaper beside his plate. Stephanie served portions of the casserole Emily had prepared earlier, while 10-year-old Marcus and Mason, she'd started thinking of them by their real names. Now that they were older, argued quietly about who got the last dinner roll. Emily picked at her food, her stomach churning with anticipation. The familiar sounds of her family's evening routine, Wyatt's methodical chewing, the twins' whispered disagreements, her mother's occasional reminders about table manners, created a backdrop that suddenly felt surreal. Wyatt was deep into an article about local water rights, muttering complaints about farmers and their irrigation practices. Emily watched him gulp down ice water between bites, his attention completely absorbed by whatever agricultural crisis was unfolding in the newspaper's pages. "The aquifer levels are dropping faster than anyone predicted," he grumbled, more to himself than to anyone else. "These farmers are draining the underground reserves like there's no tomorrow." Emily cleared her throat. The sound was small, barely noticeable, but it felt enormous to her. "Dad," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mom, I have something important to tell you both." Neither parent looked up immediately. Stephanie was cutting Marcus's portion into smaller pieces, and Wyatt was still reading, his finger tracing the lines of text as he absorbed information about water table measurements. Emily tried again, louder this time. "I really want to become a doctor, and I've already applied to multiple colleges." The effect was immediate and electric. Both parents froze as if someone had pressed pause on their lives. Wyatt's fingers stopped moving across the newspaper. Stephanie's knife remained suspended above Marcus's plate. Even the twins seemed to sense the sudden tension, their argument about the dinner roll forgotten. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Stephanie spoke. "Are you being serious right now?" Her tone carried a mixture of disbelief and something Emily couldn't quite identify, disappointment, maybe, or concern that bordered on alarm. "Yes," Emily said, meeting her mother's gaze. "I'm completely serious." Wyatt slowly folded his newspaper and set it aside, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way that always preceded an explosion. Emily recognized the signs, the tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set into a hard line. "Did Mrs. Bennet put this nonsense in your head?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Emily felt her heart sink. Mrs. Bennet had been her high school biology teacher, the one adult who had ever encouraged her academic interests, who had stayed after school to help her with advanced coursework, who had first suggested that Emily had the aptitude for medical school. That her father would reduce Mrs. Bennet's support to nonsense felt like a betrayal of everything good that had ever happened in Emily's education. "This isn't about Mrs. Bennet," Emily protested, but Wyatt was already building momentum. "I always knew that teacher was trouble," he continued, his voice rising, filling kids' heads with these romantic ideas about college, like it's some kind of magical solution to everything. She doesn't understand the real world, doesn't understand that somebody has to work, somebody has to pay the bills. Stephanie nodded, encouraged by her husband's validation. You know, Emily, 3 of my sisters went to college, and not one of them did anything useful with their degrees. They all ended up getting married anyway, becoming housewives, which is honestly the smartest thing they could have done. Think about all the money they could have saved their families if they'd just been practical from the start. The words hit Emily like physical blows. She felt herself shrinking in her chair, her carefully rehearsed arguments dissolving under the weight of her parents' certainty. But I don't want to do that, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to go to college. I want to be a doctor. The admission hung in the air like an accusation, and Emily immediately regretted her honesty. She saw something shift in her father's expression, a hardening that she recognized as dangerous. Wyatt stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a harsh screech. But instead of directing his anger at Emily, he turned on Stephanie with the fury of someone who had been personally betrayed. This is your fault, he said, his voice cold and cutting. You should have seen this coming. You should have caught the signs before she got completely brainwashed by these ridiculous ideas. Emily watched in horror as her attempt to share her dreams transformed into another battleground between her parents. This was how it always worked in the Dawson household. Problems were never addressed directly, conflicts were never resolved, and someone always had to bear the blame for situations that spiraled beyond control. Stephanie's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Emily couldn't tell. How is this my fault? I work just as many hours as you do. When was I supposed to monitor every conversation she had at school? You're her mother, Wyatt shot back. It's your job to make sure she understands her responsibilities to this family. The argument continued around her, but Emily was no longer really listening. She was calculating tuition costs, scholarship opportunities, student loan options, anything that might make her dreams possible without her family support. For the first time in her life, Emily began to understand that love and support were not the same thing, and that sometimes the people who claimed to want what was best for you were actually the biggest obstacles to achieving it. The months between Emily's dinner table confession and April passed like a held breath. The Dawson household settled into an uneasy routine, where Emily's college dreams existed as an unspoken presence, lurking beneath every mundane conversation and family obligation. Her parents had made their position clear, and Emily had retreated into careful silence, neither abandoning her plans nor discussing them. During those winter months, Emily lived a double life that exhausted her more than any amount of cleaning ever had. By day, she played the dutiful daughter, helping with Marcus and Mason's homework, preparing family dinners, maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. By night, she worked on scholarship applications in secret, researching financial aid options, and corresponding with college admissions offices through her school email account. Mrs. Bennett became her lifeline during this period, meeting with Emily during lunch breaks and after school to help her navigate the labyrinth of college preparation. Together, they filled out FAFSA forms, wrote and revised application essays, and strategized about how Emily might finance her education without family support. When April arrived with its promise of new beginnings, Emily had already received 3 acceptance letters. The one from State University came with a partial scholarship that covered 60% of her tuition, not a full ride, but enough to make her dreams feel achievable if she was willing to work for the remaining costs. She chose a Sunday morning to break the news, when the family was gathered around the breakfast table and the twins were occupied with cartoons. Emily had practiced her announcement, choosing her words carefully to emphasize the financial assistance and her willingness to work for the remaining expenses. I have something to tell you, she began, her voice steadier than her nerves. I've been accepted to State University with a partial scholarship. I've enrolled for the fall semester, and I plan to work part-time to cover the remaining costs. The reaction was swift and devastating. Wyatt's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and rage in rapid succession. She did what? He asked, as if Emily wasn't sitting right there. She did what? He repeated the question 3 more times, each iteration louder and more incredulous than the last, until Marcus and Mason stopped watching television and turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Stephanie's response came as a torrent of accusation and panic. How could you make such a huge decision without telling us? How could you go behind our backs like this? We're your parents. We have a right to know what you're planning. Emily tried to explain about the applications, the deadlines, the months of preparation, but her words were drowned out by her mother's escalating distress. Who's going to take care of Marcus and Mason? Who's going to help us with the business? Stephanie's voice climbed higher with each question. We've been counting on you, Emily. We've been making plans. That's when the real bombshell dropped. Your father and I were actually planning to let you manage the cleaning business, Stephanie announced, as if she were offering Emily a tremendous gift. We thought after high school you could take over the operations completely, handle the scheduling, supervise the work, maybe even expand to new clients. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what this meant. Not partnership, ownership of all the labor, while her parents maintained control of the profits. They weren't planning to give her a business. They were planning to make her their permanent employee, responsible for all the physical work that was wearing down their middle-aged bodies. The conversation might have continued, but the phone rang the next morning during breakfast, interrupting their tense family dynamic with an outside voice that shattered their carefully maintained denial. Wyatt answered on the 3rd ring, his usual gruff, "Hello, Dawson residents," shifting to something darker when the caller identified themselves. "This is the admissions office at State University calling for Emily Dawson regarding her enrollment confirmation and orientation schedule." Emily watched her father's face transform into something she had never seen before. Not just anger, but a kind of betrayed fury that made her stomach clench with fear. "Let me make something very clear," Wyatt said into the phone, his voice controlled but deadly. "Emily is not going anywhere. Do not call this house again. Do not send any more letters. She is not attending your school." He slammed the receiver down so hard that the entire phone base jumped on the counter. Emily felt something break inside her chest, a sound like glass shattering that only she could hear. She stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor, and found herself struggling to breathe. The kitchen seemed to tilt and spin around her, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. "Please," she whispered, looking at her father with eyes that burned with unshed tears. "Please don't do this." Wyatt's expression was stone. "Didn't we tell you no? Didn't we make our position clear?" Emily just stood there, her head bowed, feeling smaller than she had since she was 10 years old, and first realized that her childhood was over. "You're making your own life hard," Stephanie added, her tone suggesting that Emily was being deliberately difficult rather than fighting for her future. That's when Wyatt delivered his ultimatum, the words that would haunt Emily for years to come. "If you won't stop with this college nonsense, you can walk out that door right now and never come back. But if you value family, if you care about what your parents want for you, then you'll stay and accept your responsibilities." The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Emily's ragged breathing and the distant noise of morning cartoons from the living room. Marcus and Mason had stopped eating, their young faces reflecting confusion and fear as they witnessed their family fracturing in real time. Emily spent that entire day in her room, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with an impossible choice: stay and surrender her dreams, or leave and lose her family forever. She was still months away from graduating high school, still technically a minor, still dependent on parents who were now threatening to cut her off completely. She thought about Mrs. Bennett's encouragement, about the acceptance letter hidden in her desk drawer, about the partial scholarship that represented someone else's belief in her potential. Then she thought about Marcus and Mason, who would wake up tomorrow expecting her to help them get ready for school, who had never known a morning without her presence in their lives. That evening, her parents approached her with what appeared to be a softer strategy. They knocked gently on her door and entered with expressions that might have been mistaken for concern if Emily hadn't learned to recognize manipulation disguised as care. "Emily, honey," Stephanie began, her voice artificially sweet. "Have you thought about everything? Really considered all the consequences of this decision?" When Emily remained silent, Wyatt's patience evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. "Fine," he snapped. "Go ahead and pack your things. Leave. See how far you get in this world without your family." Stephanie didn't even attempt to mediate. She simply stood up and walked out of the room, disappearing into the master bedroom and closing the door with a soft click that sounded like finality. Emily sat on her bed, surrounded by the remnants of a childhood that had ended too soon, and tried to process what had just happened. She looked around her small room at the textbooks that had been her escape, at the photos of her and the twins from happier times, at the acceptance letter that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the good it would do her now. "I'm not even going to college right now," she called after her parents, her voice cracking with desperation. "I still have to finish high school. I just wanted you to know about my plans." But the house had gone completely silent, as if her words were being absorbed by walls that had witnessed too many broken dreams already. Emily realized, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that her parents weren't just opposing her college plans. They were willing to destroy their relationship with her rather than let her pursue a different life than the one they had mapped out for her. The injustice of it was breathtaking in its completeness. Not only were they denying her the chance to follow her dreams, but they were making her feel guilty for having dreams in the first place. The tears came in waves that night, each one carrying years of suppressed hurt and confusion. Emily sat on her childhood bed, surrounded by the remnants of 18 years of life, and felt the weight of her parents' ultimatum crushing down on her chest like a physical force. She had always been the compliant daughter, the one who absorbed conflict rather than created it, the one who sacrificed her own needs for family harmony. But now that same family was asking her to sacrifice her soul. For an hour, she remained paralyzed by grief and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Parents were supposed to support their children's dreams, weren't they? They were supposed to want better for the next generation. But as Emily looked around her small room at the textbooks that represented her academic achievements, at the photos of her helping Marcus and Mason with school projects, at the acceptance letter that had started this whole nightmare, she realized that her parents had never seen her as an individual with her own aspirations. They had seen her as an extension of themselves, a tool for maintaining their survival-focused existence. The realization was both devastating and liberating. When she finally began packing, Emily's hands moved with a strange calm that surprised her. She folded her clothes methodically, choosing practical items over sentimental ones. Her winter coat, her most comfortable shoes, her school supplies, her laptop gifts from a time when her parents still believed in her potential. She left behind childhood mementos and keepsakes, understanding instinctively that she was closing one chapter of her life forever. The hardest part was walking past Marcus and Mason's room. The twins were watching television, their laughter drifting through the closed door like an echo of the childhood Emily had never really gotten to experience herself. She wanted to say goodbye, to explain why she was leaving, to promise them that this wasn't their fault. But she knew that any attempt to see them would result in another confrontation with her parents, and she didn't think her fragile resolve could survive another emotional assault. Her old Corolla sat in the driveway like a faithful friend, its faded blue paint and dented bumper suddenly representing freedom rather than embarrassment. Emily had bought the car herself with money saved from countless hours of helping with the cleaning business, never imagining that it would become her lifeline to independence. As she loaded her belongings into the trunk, Emily felt her parents watching from the kitchen window. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to let doubt creep in now, couldn't risk seeing any flicker of regret or sadness in their faces that might make her question her decision. She drove with no particular destination in mind, just away from the house that had become a prison of unfulfilled expectations. The college town where State University was located seemed like the logical choice. At least there, she would be moving toward her dreams rather than running away from her problems. The first night in her car was brutal. Emily parked in a 24-hour diner's parking lot, trying to find a position that wouldn't leave her neck cramped and sore. The Corolla's seats weren't designed for sleeping. and every sound, other cars pulling in, the distant hum of traffic, footsteps on asphalt, made her hyper-aware of her vulnerability. But as uncomfortable as it was, lying there in the darkness, Emily also felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the absence of obligation. No one was going to wake her up asking for help with homework. No alarm would summon her to prepare breakfast for 4 people. No evening cleaning jobs awaited her tired body. For the first time since she was 10 years old, her time belonged entirely to her. The second night was easier, and by the third, Emily had developed a routine. She would find a safe, well-lit parking lot, preferably near a 24-hour business park, where security cameras would deter potential troublemakers, and arrange her belongings to create as much comfort as possible in the small space. During the day, she walked the streets of the college town, marveling at its energy and possibility. Students moved with purpose and excitement, carrying books and laptops, gathering in coffee shops to discuss assignments and dreams. Emily had never been part of a community focused on learning and growth, and she found herself energized by the academic atmosphere that permeated everything. Finding work took less than a week. The Sunrise Diner, a local institution that served both students and longtime residents, needed a dishwasher. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Carol who wore her graying hair in a perpetual ponytail, asked few questions and seemed impressed by Emily's willingness to work any shift. The job was exactly what Emily needed: honest work that paid enough to cover basic expenses without requiring skills she didn't have or references she couldn't provide. Standing at the industrial sink, scrubbing plates and glasses, while the controlled chaos of a busy kitchen swirled around her, Emily found an unexpected peace. The work was repetitive but not mindless, physical but not backbreaking, and it came with the added benefit of free meals during her shifts. The practical challenges of her new life required creativity and determination. Showering meant stopping at truck stops on the outskirts of town, where she could pay for facilities and clean up properly. Laundry required careful budgeting and trips to the 24-hour laundromat. She learned to pack efficiently, to make every dollar stretch, to find comfort in small luxuries like hot coffee or a paperback novel from the used bookstore. But it wasn't just survival. Emily was discovering aspects of herself that had been buried under years of family obligation. She could spend her lunch breaks reading biology textbooks from the college bookstore. She could take evening walks through the campus, imagining herself as a student. She could make decisions based entirely on her own preferences and needs. Still, there were moments when the isolation felt overwhelming. The college town was filled with families, celebrating their children's achievements, graduation ceremonies, move-in days, parents and students laughing together over meals. Emily would watch these scenes from a distance and feel the absence of familial support like a physical ache. She tried to imagine her parents in these scenarios, pictured Wyatt beaming with pride as she received her diploma, or Stephanie helping her move into a dorm room. But the images felt impossible, like trying to imagine snow in summer. It was during one of these melancholy evenings that Emily met Rick Teeman. She was at the laundromat, feeding quarters into the washing machine and watching her meager wardrobe tumble through sudsy water when an elderly man entered carrying a canvas bag bulging with clothes. He looked to be in his 60s, with silver hair that stuck up at odd angles and deep lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and sorrow. Rick loaded his clothes into the machine next to hers, then began patting his pockets with increasing urgency. Emily watched him pull out a handful of coins, count them twice, then check his other pockets with the desperation of someone who had calculated his resources down to the penny. "Shoot," he muttered, then looked toward the change machine with the expression of someone who knew it wouldn't help his situation. As he began walking toward the exit, clearly planning to return another day when his finances were better aligned with his laundry needs, Emily felt compelled to act. "Excuse me," she called out. "Do you need some quarters? I have extra." Rick turned back, his weathered face brightening with surprise and gratitude. "That would be incredibly kind, but I couldn't take money from a sweet girl like you." The word sweet hit Emily like a small miracle. When was the last time anyone had described her that way? Her parents had always focused on her usefulness, her reliability, her willingness to sacrifice. But this stranger saw sweetness in her simple offer of help. Emily smiled, genuinely smiled for what felt like the first time in months. "It's just a couple of dollars. I'd be happy to help." She handed him the quarters, and Rick's gratitude was so genuine and effusive that Emily found herself laughing. But what happened next was even better. As Rick started his laundry, he began talking, not asking Emily personal questions or trying to solve her obvious problems, but simply sharing stories. He told her about his morning at the hardware store, where he had witnessed an elaborate disagreement between two customers about the proper way to hang a bird feeder. His description of their escalating debate, complete with hand gestures and passionate arguments about seed distribution, was so vivid and absurd that Emily found herself genuinely entertained. By the time Rick finished his second story, this one about a miscommunication at the grocery store that resulted in him accidentally purchasing 12 pounds of rutabagas, Emily was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes. "Are you a writer or a comedian?" she asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Rick's smile was both mischievous and sad. "I wish I were either one. Truth is, I've seen too much bad stuff in my life. Figured out a long time ago that I have to make myself laugh once in a while to stay sane." There was something in his tone that made Emily understand that Rick's humor wasn't just entertainment, it was survival strategy, a way of processing pain and finding light in dark places. She recognized the technique because she had been unconsciously developing her own version, finding small moments of joy and possibility, even while sleeping in her car and working in a diner kitchen. When their laundry finished, Emily and Rick folded their clothes in companionable silence. As she prepared to leave, Emily extended her hand. "It was really nice meeting you," she said. "Thank you for the stories." "Rick Teeman," he replied, shaking her hand with surprising strength. "And thank you for the quarters and the company. Both were exactly what I needed tonight." The night air was crisp as Emily arranged her clean laundry in the back seat of the Corolla, creating the familiar nest of pillows and blankets that had become her bedroom. She was humming one of Rick's ridiculous songs about the newspaper-stealing cat when everything changed in an instant. The car door yanked open with violent force, and before Emily could even process what was happening, rough hands grabbed her shoulders and dragged her halfway out of the vehicle. The smell hit her first: stale cigarettes, unwashed clothes, and something sharp and chemical that made her stomach lurch. "Give me your purse," the man hissed, his grip tightening on her arms until she could feel her circulation cutting off. He was younger than Emily had first thought, maybe mid-20s, with the desperate, hollow look of someone who had made too many bad decisions and was now trapped by them. Emily's training from years of managing crisis situations with the twins kicked in, and she tried to stay calm. Okay, she said, reaching slowly toward her small purse on the passenger seat. "Just take it. I don't want any trouble." But the man's grip didn't loosen. If anything, he pulled her closer. And Emily realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about money. His eyes had a wild, unfocused quality that spoke of drugs or desperation or something worse. When she tried to hand him the purse, he knocked it away, sending her meager savings scattering across the asphalt. "Please," Emily whispered, as the man's free hand moved toward her face. "Please don't." That's when he covered her mouth with his palm, the taste of dirt and salt making her gag. Emily had never felt so helpless in her life. All her years of taking care of others, of being strong and reliable and capable, meant nothing in the face of raw physical power. She couldn't scream, could barely breathe, and her arms felt like they might snap under his grip. Time seemed to slow down as Emily's mind raced through terrible possibilities. Was this how her story ended? After finally finding the courage to leave her family and pursue her dreams, would she become another statistic in a college town police report? The irony was devastating. She had survived her parents' emotional cruelty, only to face something infinitely worse in a laundromat parking lot. The man was saying something, but his words sounded distant and muffled. Emily's vision started to blur around the edges, whether from fear or lack of oxygen. She couldn't tell. She tried to fight back, but her movements felt sluggish and ineffective. Then, suddenly, the pressure disappeared. The man's body went completely limp, his weight collapsing forward until he was draped across Emily like a heavy, unconscious blanket. For a moment, she couldn't understand what had happened. Then she saw the silhouette standing outside her car, a familiar figure backlit by the harsh fluorescent lights of the laundromat. "Emily? Are you okay?" Rick's voice cut through her shock like a lifeline. She pushed the unconscious man away from her, scrambling backward until she was fully inside her car, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and relief. I think so," she managed, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "My wrist hurts, but I'm okay. I'm okay." Rick moved with surprising efficiency for his age, dragging the unconscious attacker away from the car and checking his pockets for weapons. "There have been several robberies in this area lately," he said, his tone grim but reassuring. "I've been worried about people parking here overnight. This must be one of the guys the police have been looking for." Emily watched in amazement as Rick used strips torn from the attacker's own shirt to bind his hands. The old man's movements were practiced and confident, as if this wasn't his first time dealing with dangerous situations. "How did you know to come back?" Emily asked, still trying to process what had just happened. Rick glanced at her with something that might have been embarrassment. "I was walking home and realized I forgot my reading glasses in the laundromat. When I saw your car rocking and heard the commotion," he shrugged. "Seemed like you might need help." The police arrived within minutes of Rick's call, their red and blue lights painting the parking lot in alternating colors of urgency and relief. The attacker had regained consciousness by then, groggily trying to explain away his presence with a story about mistaking Emily's car for his friend's vehicle. The officers weren't buying it, especially when they found her scattered money and the improvised restraints. As they loaded the man into their patrol car, one of the officers took Emily's statement. She found herself downplaying the severity of what had almost happened, focusing on the attempted robbery rather than the more disturbing possibilities. The officer seemed to understand what she wasn't saying, and his gentle questions helped her realize how close she had come to something truly terrible. After the police left, Emily and Rick sat on the concrete curb outside the laundromat, neither of them quite ready to return to their separate lives. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving Emily feeling shaky and emotionally raw. It was then that Rick's trained eye took in the details of her situation: the car packed with belongings, the makeshift bedding, the careful way she had organized her limited possessions. "How long have you been living like this?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, only concern. Emily considered lying or deflecting, but something about Rick's steady presence made honesty feel safer than pretense. "A couple of months," she admitted. "Since I left home." Rick's expression shifted, the gentle humor that had characterized their earlier interaction replaced by something deeper and more paternal. "Is everything all right, kiddo?" The endearment hit Emily like a physical blow. When was the last time an adult had called her something affectionate? When had anyone shown concern for her well-being without wanting something in return? She tried to shrug off the question, to maintain the facade of independence that had gotten her through the past few months. But her eyes betrayed her, filling with tears that she tried desperately to hide. She didn't want to appear weak, not after everything she had endured. Her journey toward independence had only just begun, and she couldn't afford to fall apart now. Rick seemed to understand her internal struggle. He didn't push for details or offer empty reassurances. Instead, he sat quietly beside her on the curb, his presence solid and comforting, giving Emily the space to process her emotions without feeling pressured to explain them. After several minutes of companionable silence, Rick began talking again. This time, his story started mysteriously something about a fishing trip that had gone wrong, a boat that wouldn't start, and a series of increasingly absurd mishaps that culminated in Rick being rescued by a family of tourists who turned out to be from his hometown. The way he told it, with perfect timing and unexpected details, had Emily laughing despite herself. The laughter felt good, like a release of pressure she hadn't even realized was building inside her chest. Rick had this gift for finding absurdity in ordinary situations, for transforming potentially embarrassing or frustrating experiences into sources of joy and connection. When their laughter faded and comfortable quiet settled between them again, Rick made an offer that surprised them both. "Look," he said, his tone carefully casual. "Whatever brought you to live in your car is none of my business. But tonight, after what just happened, I'd feel better if you came back to my place. I made a fish stew earlier, came back from a fishing trip this afternoon, with more bass than one old man can reasonably eat. You could have a real meal, maybe a hot shower, sleep on something more comfortable than a car seat." He held up his hands in a gesture of harmless intent. "Now, I know what you're thinking. What sane young woman follows a strange old man to his home? If I were you, I'd be suspicious too. But after tonight, I can't in good conscience let you stay in this parking lot alone." Emily studied Rick's weathered face, seeing genuine concern rather than any ulterior motive. Her instincts, honed by years of reading people's intentions and managing difficult situations, told her that Rick was exactly what he appeared to be, a lonely old man who had stumbled into her life at exactly the right moment. More than that, she sensed that Rick needed the company as much as she needed the safety and comfort he was offering. There was something in his eyes that spoke of long evenings spent alone, of stories told to empty rooms, of kindness that rarely found an outlet. The 15-minute drive through winding country roads felt like a journey into a different world. Emily followed Rick's ancient pickup truck, her Corolla's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as they left the college town's bright streetlights behind. When they finally turned into Sunset Meadows Trailer Park, Emily felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension settle in her stomach. The trailer park was nothing like the stereotypes she had grown up hearing. The mobile homes were well maintained, most with small gardens and decorative touches that spoke of residents who took pride in their community. String lights draped between porches created a warm, welcoming atmosphere, and Emily could see families through lit windows, gathered around dinner tables and television sets. Rick's trailer sat at the end of a quiet row, distinguished by its neat appearance and the impressive vegetable garden that stretched along one side. A large hammock was strung between two oak trees in the back, and Emily could see fishing equipment organized on the small front porch. As they parked and got out of their vehicles, Rick seemed suddenly self-conscious about his home. "It's not much," he said, fumbling with his keys, "but it's clean and warm, and the neighbors are good people." Inside, Emily was surprised by how spacious and comfortable the trailer felt. Rick had arranged his furniture thoughtfully, creating distinct areas for eating, relaxing, and reading. Books lined makeshift shelves, and the walls were decorated with photographs of fishing trips and what looked like military service pictures from decades past. The smell of the fish stew filled the small kitchen, rich and comforting in a way that reminded Emily of the rare occasions when her family had cooked together rather than rushing through meals between work obligations. Rick moved efficiently around the space, setting the small table for two and ladling generous portions into mismatched bowls. As they ate, Rick's story began to emerge in fragments, offered freely but without self-pity. He had served 3 tours in Vietnam, he told her, giving some of the best years of his life to a cause he gradually came to understand was more complicated than the patriotic ideals that had motivated his enlistment. "I believed I was fighting for freedom," he said, stirring his stew thoughtfully. "Took me years to realize I was mostly fighting for other people's business interests. The country asked for everything I had to give, and I gave it. When I came back, well..." He gestured around the trailer with a wry smile. "Let's just say the gratitude didn't last as long as the nightmares." The war had damaged more than just Rick's faith in government. Emily learned that his exposure to Agent Orange had left him unable to father children, a devastating blow that ultimately ended his marriage. His wife, Sarah, had stayed with him for 5 difficult years after his return, but the combination of his PTSD, their childlessness, and the financial struggles that plagued many veterans proved too much for their relationship to survive. "She wasn't a bad person," Rick said, and Emily heard no bitterness in his voice. "Sometimes love isn't enough when circumstances are working against you." Now, Rick worked at Thompson Mill, a lumber processing facility about 20 minutes from the trailer park. The work was steady and honest, he explained. and it provided enough income to cover his modest needs. He had his colleagues to talk with during work hours, men who understood the rhythms of physical labor and the satisfaction of a job completed well. Emily was puzzled by one detail. "If you have everything you need here," she asked, gesturing toward the compact washing machine she could see in an alcove off the kitchen, "what were you doing at the laundromat tonight?" Rick's cheeks reddened slightly, and his admission came with endearing honesty. "Hoping to meet someone I could talk to. During the week, I have the guys at the mill, but weekends—" He shrugged. "Weekends can get pretty quiet around here. I figured a laundromat might be a place where people have time to chat while they wait for their clothes to finish." The loneliness in his statement made Emily's chest tighten with recognition. She understood the particular ache of having no one to share stories with, no one to ask about your day or care about your small triumphs and frustrations. After dinner, they moved to Rick's small front porch, where two lawn chairs faced the quiet street, and the evening sounds of the trailer park created a gentle backdrop for conversation. Rick talked about how different the world had become since his youth, how technology had connected people in some ways while isolating them in others. His observations were thoughtful and often amusing, delivered with the same storytelling skill that had entertained Emily at the laundromat. When the conversation eventually turned to Emily's situation, she found herself telling Rick everything: her parents' opposition to her college dreams, the ultimatum that had forced her to leave home, her months of sleeping in her car and working at the diner. Rick listened without interruption, his expressions cycling through surprise, anger, and what looked like genuine sorrow for what she had endured. "They really told you to choose between your dreams and your family?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Emily nodded, surprised by how much Rick's indignation on her behalf meant to her. Her parents had made her feel selfish and unreasonable for wanting more than they could envision for her, but Rick's reaction validated her own sense that their demands had been unfair. "That's not what parents are supposed to do," Rick said firmly. "Parents are supposed to help their children reach higher than they ever could." "What they did to you!" He shook his head. "That's not love, kiddo. That's fear disguised as control." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts as the trailer park settled into evening quiet around them. Eventually, Emily stood up, stretching muscles that still ached from her earlier attack. "I should probably get going," she said, though the prospect of returning to her car felt more daunting than usual. "Thank you for saving my life tonight, Rick, and for the most delicious dinner I've had in months." Rick stood up too, his weathered face creased with concern. He glanced toward Emily's Corolla, then back at her face, and Emily could see him making calculations about her safety and comfort. "You know," he said quietly, "from early April until late October, I sleep in that hammock back there." He gestured toward the trees behind his trailer. "Love falling asleep under the stars, listening to the night sounds. Been doing it for years." Emily wasn't sure where he was going with this information, but something in his tone suggested importance. "The thing is," Rick continued, "that means my trailer sits mostly empty at night. Just seems wasteful, having all that space and a perfectly good bed going unused." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "You could stay here if you wanted to, just until you get on your feet. Find something more permanent." The offer hung in the air between them, generous and unexpected. Emily felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of despair or fear. They were tears of gratitude for kindness she hadn't expected to find. "You shouldn't be out there alone, kiddo," Rick added gently. "Please stay." Emily looked at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. Rick was offering her not just shelter, but the dignity of choice, the safety of genuine care, and the rare gift of kindness without strings attached. The decision felt both significant and inevitable. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "Thank you." That night, for the first time since leaving her childhood home, Emily fell asleep in a real bed with clean sheets, her car keys within easy reach, but her guard finally lowered. Through the trailer's thin walls, she could hear Rick settling into his hammock, humming softly to himself as the spring night embraced them both. It was the beginning of healing she didn't even know she needed. The routine developed naturally, like a river finding its course. Every evening, Emily would pull into the trailer park just as Rick's old pickup came rumbling down the gravel road from the mill. She had grown to love that sound, the familiar rumble of his engine that meant safety, warmth, and the promise of another evening filled with laughter and stories. Rick turned out to be an extraordinary cook, a skill he developed during his years of living alone. He could transform simple ingredients into meals that tasted like celebrations. His beef stew was legendary, simmered for hours with herbs from his garden. His cornbread was so perfect that Emily suspected he had some secret family recipe he wasn't sharing. Even his scrambled eggs somehow tasted better than anyone else's. Fluffy and rich, and served with a side of whatever amusing observation he'd made about his day at the mill, their evenings followed a comfortable pattern. After dinner, they would sit on the small front porch, Rick in his favorite lawn chair and Emily curled up in the other, watching the trailer park settle into evening quiet around them. Rick's stories seemed endless tales from his military service, mishaps at the mill, observations about their neighbors, memories from his childhood in rural Kentucky. He had a gift for finding humor in ordinary moments and for making even mundane experiences sound like adventures. Weekends brought new dimensions to their relationship. Rick would wake Emily early on Saturday mornings, his enthusiasm infectious as he prepared their fishing gear. "The fish are biting at dawn," he'd say, though Emily suspected his real motivation was sharing the peaceful beauty of the lake with someone who could appreciate it. Those fishing trips became Emily's favorite part of the week. There was something magical about sitting in Rick's small boat as the sun rose over the water, listening to him explain the subtleties of different lures and the habits of various fish species. He taught her patience in a way no one ever had, showing her how to read the water's surface for signs of fish, how to cast her line with precision, how to wait for the subtle tug that meant success. "Fishing isn't really about catching fish," Rick told her one morning as they watched their lines disappear into the dark water. "It's about learning to be still, learning to pay attention to things that matter. Most people never learn that skill." On other weekends, Rick introduced Emily to something that proved even more valuable than fishing: self-defense. His military training had included extensive hand-to-hand combat, and he was determined that Emily would never again find herself as helpless as she had been in that laundromat parking lot. These lessons took place in the small clearing behind his trailer, where Rick had set up a makeshift training area with old tires and wooden posts. He taught her basic techniques with patience and precision, how to break free from various holds, how to use an attacker's momentum against them, where to strike for maximum effect. "The goal isn't to win a fight," he explained as he showed her how to escape from a wrist grab. "The goal is to create enough space to get away. Your brain is your best weapon, kiddo. Everything else is just backup." Emily threw herself into these lessons with the same intensity she brought to her studies. The physical training helped her process months of accumulated stress and fear, while Rick's careful instruction rebuilt her confidence in her own capabilities. When college finally began, Emily felt prepared in ways that had nothing to do with academics. Rick had given her something her parents never had: unconditional support and the quiet confidence that came from being valued for who she was, rather than what she could do for others. Her course load was demanding. Pre-med requirements meant biology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics, along with the general education courses required for her degree. Emily attacked her studies with fierce determination, spending hours in the library, forming study groups with other serious students, meeting with professors during office hours to clarify difficult concepts. But maintaining her work schedule alongside her academic responsibilities proved more challenging than she had anticipated. The diner shifts that had once provided structure and income now felt like obstacles to her education. She would arrive at work exhausted from late-night study sessions, or miss opportunities for additional studying because she needed to earn money for living expenses. Rick noticed the strain first. Emily would come home from her evening shifts at the diner looking hollow-eyed and overwhelmed, her textbooks under her arm and stress radiating from every movement. She would sit at the small kitchen table, surrounded by notes and assignments, pushing herself through homework while fighting to stay awake. "You're running yourself ragged, kiddo," Rick observed one evening as Emily dozed off over her organic chemistry textbook. "Something's got to give." Emily rubbed her eyes and attempted to focus on molecular structures that seemed to swim across the page. "I can handle it. I just need to get into a better rhythm." But Rick's concerns proved justified when the financial crisis arrived in the form of an official letter from the university's bursar office. Emily's partial scholarship had covered the initial enrollment costs, but the remaining tuition balance was substantial. Several $1,000s that represented more money than Emily had ever possessed at one time. The first notice was polite but firm, giving Emily 30 days to submit payment or arrange an approved payment plan. When she didn't respond immediately, the letters became more frequent and urgent. Past due notices arrived weekly, each one carrying the implicit threat that her enrollment could be terminated if payment wasn't received. Emily scheduled a meeting with her academic advisor, hoping to find some solution that wouldn't require her to leave school. Dean Morrison was sympathetic but realistic about the university's policies. "I can speak with the financial aid office about a payment plan," he promised, reviewing Emily's academic record. "Your grades are excellent, and your professors have nothing but good things to say about your dedication. Let me see what options might be available." For 2 weeks, Emily waited anxiously for word about her financial situation. The stress affected everything: her sleep, her appetite, her ability to concentrate during lectures. She began calculating how many extra shifts she could work at the diner, whether she could find additional part-time employment, if there were any scholarships or grants she hadn't yet explored. Then, suddenly, the notices stopped coming. When Emily received her next paycheck, she went immediately to the bursar office, intending to make what payment she could toward her balance. The student worker behind the desk pulled up her account information and delivered news that left Emily speechless. "Your tuition is paid in full," the young woman said, checking her computer screen twice to confirm. "Shows here that Rick Teeman paid the entire year's balance last week." Emily stood frozen in the financial aid office, other students moving around her as she struggled to process what she had just learned. Rick had paid her tuition thousands of dollars without consulting her, without making it into a negotiation or a loan with terms and expectations. The drive home felt endless. Emily's emotions cycled through gratitude, embarrassment, confusion, and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. Rick had given her the gift of education, of uninterrupted focus on her dreams, of freedom from the financial stress that had been consuming her thoughts for weeks. She found him in his usual evening spot, swaying gently in the hammock, strung between the oak trees behind his trailer. The sight of him there, peaceful and content, made Emily's chest tighten with overwhelming emotion. "Why did you pay my tuition?" she asked, standing in front of the hammock with tears already threatening to spill down her cheeks. Rick stopped swaying and sat up, his weathered face creased with concern at her tone. "Because you don't need to be working yourself to death, kiddo. You need to concentrate on your studies, on becoming the doctor you're meant to be." Emily shook her head, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his gesture. "But that's so much money, Rick. I feel awful that somehow I made you." "You didn't make me do anything," Rick interrupted gently, standing up from the hammock to face her directly. "I wanted to do it. I've got more money sitting in that bank account than I'll ever need before I die. What's the point of having it if I can't use it to help someone who matters to me?" He took her hands in his calloused ones, his touch gentle but firm. "You go ahead and become a doctor, Emily. Show them what you're worth. Show yourself what you're capable of when you have the support you deserve." As he spoke, Rick's eyes filled with tears he was trying hard to hide. He released her hands and started to turn back toward the hammock, attempting to mask his emotion with an awkward comment about leftover soup in the refrigerator. But Emily had seen the tears, had recognized the profound love behind his gesture. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace that conveyed everything words couldn't capture. Hugging Rick felt like coming home in a way Emily had never experienced. Her own father had never held her like this, without conditions or expectations, without the weight of disappointment or the demand for gratitude. This was pure affection, the kind of love that asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to give. Rick's arms came around her slowly, as if he were afraid she might disappear. Emily realized that this moment was as meaningful for him as it was for her, that in becoming the father she had never had, Rick was also becoming the parent he had never been allowed to be. "Thank you," Emily whispered against his shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for being everything my father should have been." They stood there for a long moment, two people who had found family in the most unexpected place, who had discovered that love didn't require blood or legal documents or shared history. Sometimes it just required showing up for each other when it mattered most. That evening, Emily cooked dinner. Her attempt at beef stew wasn't nearly as sophisticated as his usual creations, but she poured all her gratitude and love into the preparation. She baked an apple pie from scratch, following a recipe she found in one of Rick's cookbooks, determined to give him something tangible to match the enormity of what he had given her. As they ate together that night, Emily felt something shift in their relationship. They were no longer just two lonely people who had found each other by accident. They were family, chosen family, built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation or circumstance. From that night forward, Emily approached her studies with renewed energy, knowing that Rick's sacrifice had bought her something precious: time. Time to focus, time to excel, time to become the doctor she had always dreamed of being. Most importantly, she had learned something her biological parents had never taught her: that real love meant wanting the best for someone else, even when it required sacrifice, even when it meant letting them grow beyond your own understanding or experience. Rick had given her more than tuition money. He had given her the foundation she needed to build the life she had always imagined, supported by someone who believed in her potential without needing to control its direction. 8 years passed, like pages turning in a well-loved book, each semester bringing Emily closer to her dream, while deepening the bonds that had transformed two strangers into an unbreakable family. The pre-med courses that had once seemed impossibly challenging became stepping stones to medical school, and medical school itself became the foundation for Emily's surgical residency. Throughout those demanding years, Rick remained Emily's constant source of support and encouragement. When she stumbled through organic chemistry, he would sit with her at the kitchen table, patiently listening as she explained complex molecular structures until she understood them well enough to teach them to someone else. When the pressure of medical school threatened to overwhelm her, Rick would insist on fishing trips that reminded her there was a world beyond textbooks and examinations. "You know what separates good doctors from great ones?" Rick asked one evening as Emily struggled through her clinical rotations, exhausted by 18-hour days and the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. "Great doctors remember that healing is about more than just fixing what's broken. It's about giving people hope, treating them like they matter." Emily would carry that wisdom with her through every patient interaction, every surgery, every moment when medical knowledge had to be balanced with human compassion. Rick seemed to exist outside of time during those years. While Emily transformed from an uncertain teenager into a confident young woman, while her hands learned the precision required for surgery and her mind absorbed the vast complexity of human medicine, Rick remained steady and unchanging. His hair grew a little grayer. The lines around his eyes deepened slightly, but his essential spirit, that combination of gentle humor and unwavering strength, stayed constant. The only significant change in their household came during Emily's final year of residency, when she met Michael Patterson at the hospital. Michael was completing his fellowship in pediatric medicine, and Emily was immediately drawn to his quiet competence and genuine caring for his young patients. Rick took to Michael immediately, appreciating the younger man's respect for Emily's intelligence and his willingness to listen to stories about fishing and military service without the glazed-over politeness that many people Emily's age showed toward older adults. When Emily finally graduated from her surgical residency and received her first attending physician salary, the number on her paycheck felt surreal. After years of student poverty and the constant awareness that Rick's generosity was sustaining her dreams, Having substantial income of her own felt like stepping into an entirely different life. Her first major purchase was not clothes or a car or any of the luxuries she had foregone during her training. Instead, Emily spent weeks researching neighborhoods, consulting with real estate agents, and carefully calculating mortgage payments until she found exactly what she was looking for. A beautiful colonial-style house with a large backyard, mature oak trees. The surprise party required elaborate planning and careful coordination with Michael and the small circle of friends Emily had accumulated during medical school and residency. She told Rick she was having a medical emergency and needed him to come to an unfamiliar address immediately, a deception that made her feel guilty, even as she knew how much Rick would appreciate the surprise. Rick arrived within 20 minutes. His face creased with worry as he knocked on the front door of the house. Emily's friend Sarah opened the door and led him into the living room, where everyone was crouched behind furniture in barely contained excitement. The moment Rick stepped into the center of the room, Emily and her friends exploded from their hiding places, shouting "Happy birthday" with the enthusiasm of children. Rick's 72nd birthday had been approaching, but Emily knew he never celebrated it, just as he rarely acknowledged his own needs or desires. Rick's face cycled through confusion, relief, and pure joy as he realized what was happening. But Emily had saved the biggest surprise for last. She approached Rick with an envelope in her hands, her heart pounding with anticipation of his reaction. "I have something for you," she said, extending the envelope toward him. Rick opened it carefully, his weathered fingers shaking slightly as he pulled out the deed and house keys. His eyebrows drew together in confusion as he tried to process what he was looking at. "This is your house now," Emily announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "I got the down payment, and I'll be making the mortgage payments. You're going to move in here and let me take care of you for a change." Rick looked up from the papers, his expression shifting between disbelief and something that might have been panic. "Emily, kiddo, this island, this has to be some kind of joke." "It's not a joke at all," Emily said firmly. She turned to address the room full of people who had become her chosen family over the years. "Everyone here needs to understand something about this man. Rick Teeman is my real father, not by blood, but by choice. He gave me everything when I had nothing. He made my dreams possible when my own parents tried to destroy them. He taught me what real love looks like, and now it's time for me to pay some of that back." The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Rick's quiet crying. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he looked around at the faces of people who had gathered to celebrate him, people who knew him only through Emily's stories, but who understood his significance in her life. Rick stood there holding the deed to his new house, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Emily's gesture, but also by something deeper. For the first time since his wife had left him decades earlier, Rick felt truly seen and valued, not just for what he could provide, but for who he was as a person. After the other guests left, Rick walked through every room of the house with the careful attention of someone trying to memorize important details. He admired the hardwood floors, the updated kitchen, the way afternoon light streamed through the large windows in what Emily had designated as his bedroom. "It's a beautiful house," he said, running his hand along the smooth banister of the staircase. "You chose well, kiddo." Emily followed behind him, pointing out features she had specifically selected with him in mind: the front porch where he could sit in the evenings, the basement workshop space where he could pursue projects, the large backyard where he could plant the vegetable garden she knew he missed from the trailer park. "My plan is to find another house close by," Emily explained as they stood in the kitchen. "That way we can be neighbors instead of roommates. You'll have your independence, but I'll be right there if you need anything." Emily was arranging flowers in a vase when Rick's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, the endearment carrying weight they both understood. "Thank you for this. It's more generous than I ever expected or deserved, but my hammock is still hanging behind the trailer, and it's been waiting for me to come home." Emily turned around, her face immediately filled with concern and disappointment. She had been so sure this would be the perfect gift, the ideal way to ensure Rick's comfort and safety as he aged. But looking at his expression, she began to understand that she had misread what he actually wanted. Rick approached her and took her hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Proud of the doctor you've become. Proud of the woman you've grown into. Proud that I got to be part of your journey. Meeting you was the greatest blessing of my life." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But that trailer has been my home for 30 years. It's where I learned to be happy again after the war, where I figured out how to live alone without being lonely. It's where I brought a scared young woman who needed shelter, and where I watched her become stronger than she ever knew she could be." Emily felt tears beginning to form as she realized what Rick was trying to tell her. Rick smiled and squeezed her hands. "Besides," he added with a return to his familiar humor, "you're going to need this space when the grandkids arrive. And you won't be able to get rid of me then. I'll be around all the time, spoiling those children and teaching them how to fish." 6 months later, Michael proposed to Emily in the very living room where she had tried to give Rick a house. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony in Rick's backyard at the trailer park, surrounded by neighbors who had watched Emily grow from a frightened teenager into a confident surgeon and who welcomed Michael into their extended community with open arms. Emily and Michael moved into the house that had been intended as Rick's gift, creating their first home together in the space Emily had chosen with such care. Rick remained in his trailer, but the physical distance between them felt meaningless compared to the emotional closeness they had maintained throughout Emily's transformation. When Johnny arrived a year later, Rick's prediction proved absolutely accurate. He became a grandfather with the same intensity and dedication he had brought to being Emily's father, showing up at the hospital within hours of the birth and spending the next several days learning to change diapers and heat bottles with scientific precision. Johnny's arrival brought Rick a joy he hadn't experienced since Emily first walked into his life. He would spend hours reading to the baby, singing old military songs in a surprisingly melodic voice, and explaining the finer points of fishing to an infant who responded with fascination to Rick's animated storytelling. When Emily and Michael returned to their demanding medical careers, Rick seamlessly transitioned into his role as primary babysitter. He would arrive at their house each morning, with stories planned for Johnny's entertainment and homemade food prepared for Emily and Michael's dinner. His days revolved around nap schedules and feeding times, and he approached childcare with the same patient attention to detail he had once applied to military operations and mill work. "You know," Emily told Michael one evening as they watched Rick push Johnny on the swing set they had installed in their backyard, "I used to worry that Rick was lonely. Now I think he was just waiting for his real family to find him." Michael nodded, observing the pure contentment on Rick's face as Johnny squealed with delight. "He's got more energy with that baby than most people half his age. Johnny's lucky to have him as a grandfather." Emily smiled, remembering her own childhood spent caring for Marcus and Mason while longing for someone to take care of her. Now her son would grow up, surrounded by the kind of unconditional love she had only discovered as an adult, and Rick would experience the joy of being needed and appreciated without any of the burden or resentment that had characterized his earlier relationships. The emergency call came on a Saturday morning when Emily was enjoying one of her rare weekends off. She had been sitting on the back porch, watching Rick teach 18-month-old Johnny how to identify different birds in their backyard, when her phone buzzed with the urgent message that would change everything. "Spinal tumor removal. Emergency surgery needed. Patient is prepped and waiting." Michael looked up from the medical journal he was reading. "Another weekend ruined by someone else's crisis," he said with the weary humor that all medical professionals developed as a survival mechanism. Emily kissed Johnny's forehead and squeezed Rick's shoulder. "I'll be back as soon as I can. This one sounds complicated." Rick's weathered hand covered hers briefly. "You'll do fine, kiddo. You always do." The drive to the hospital gave Emily time to review what she knew about the case. Spinal tumors were among the most challenging surgeries in her field, requiring precision, patience, and the kind of steady hands that came only from years of practice. One wrong move could result in paralysis or death. But Emily had performed dozens of these procedures, and her reputation for successful outcomes had made her the go-to surgeon for the most difficult cases. She was reviewing the patient files at the nurse's station when something made her blood freeze in her veins. Stephanie Dawson, age 52. Emergency admission for suspected spinal tumor causing severe pain and mobility issues. Emily stared at the name until the letters seemed to rearrange themselves on the page. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the full file, confirming what she already knew with sickening certainty. Patient's next of kin, Wyatt Dawson, husband. Emergency contacts included 2 sons, Marcus and Mason, both listed as college students. For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. The bustling sounds of the hospital monitors beeping, staff calling to each other, the constant hum of life-saving activity faded into white noise as she confronted the impossible coincidence that had placed her mother's life literally in her hands. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician who had called Emily in, approached with the urgency that marked all emergency situations. "Dr. Patterson, are you ready to scrub in? The patient is deteriorating rapidly, and we need to operate immediately." Emily's medical training kicked in, overriding the emotional chaos threatening to consume her rational mind. She had sworn an oath to first do no harm, and that oath didn't include exceptions for personal grievances or family complications. "I'll need 15 minutes to review the imaging," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Has the patient been informed about the risks?" "Family has been notified. Husband is in the waiting room." Emily closed the file and headed toward the surgical suite, her mind automatically shifting into the focused, methodical thinking that had made her an exceptional surgeon. Whatever Stephanie Dawson had done to her as a parent, she was now simply a patient who needed Emily's expertise to survive. The surgery required every ounce of Emily's skill and concentration. The tumor was located in a particularly dangerous position, wrapped around nerve clusters that controlled basic mobility functions. Emily worked with microscopic precision, using laser technology to remove cancerous tissue, while preserving the healthy nerves that would determine whether her patient would ever walk again. Throughout the 4-hour procedure, Emily maintained complete professional detachment. Her hands never wavered, her concentration never broke, and her surgical team later commented that it was one of the most technically perfect operations they had ever witnessed. Only when the last suture was placed and Stephanie was wheeled to recovery did Emily allow herself to acknowledge the strange turns life had taken. She had just saved the life of the woman who had tried to destroy her dreams, using skills that woman had insisted were worthless. Hospital protocol required Emily to speak with family members about the surgery's outcome. She found Wyatt Dawson in the surgical waiting room, looking older and more fragile than she remembered. His hair had gone completely gray, and worry had carved new lines around his eyes. He was alone. Marcus and Mason were apparently away at college, living the educational opportunities that Emily had been denied. Emily approached him while still wearing her surgical mask, her voice carefully modulated to maintain professional distance. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Dr. Patterson. The surgery went very well. We were able to remove the entire tumor, and there's no indication of nerve damage. Your wife should make a full recovery." Wyatt's relief was immediate and overwhelming. He sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him, tears streaming down his cheeks as he processed the news that his wife would survive. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much. How long will she need to stay in the hospital?" "Probably about a week for observation and initial recovery. She'll need physical therapy, but with proper care, she should regain full mobility within a few months." Over the following week, Emily checked on Stephanie's progress with the same thorough attention she gave all her post-surgical patients. She maintained her professional mask, both literally and figuratively, asking about pain levels, monitoring healing progress, and adjusting medications as needed. Stephanie was weak but responsive, answering Emily's questions in the slow, careful manner of someone recovering from major surgery. She complimented the hospital staff, expressed gratitude for the excellent care she was receiving, and never showed any sign of recognizing the masked surgeon who visited her each day. The day of Stephanie's discharge arrived with the kind of scheduling complexity that made maintaining Emily's anonymity impossible. Several doctors needed to sign off on the discharge paperwork. Nurses had to provide care instructions, and hospital policy required the primary surgeon to be present for final recommendations. Emily stood outside Stephanie's room, knowing that walking through that door would end the strange anonymity that had protected her from emotional complications for the past week. But duty was duty, and she had never been one to avoid difficult situations. She entered the room to find Stephanie dressed and sitting in a wheelchair, with Wyatt beside her organizing discharge papers. Several nurses and attending physicians were present, creating the kind of professional atmosphere that would make a dramatic confrontation inappropriate. "Good morning, everyone," Emily said, removing her mask as she approached Stephanie's bedside. The reaction was immediate and electric. Stephanie's face went completely white, and her mouth fell open in shock. Wyatt dropped the papers he was holding, and his expression cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been fear. "Emily?" Stephanie whispered, her voice barely audible. The tension in the room was so palpable that one of the nurses immediately noticed. "Dr. Patterson, is everything all right?" Emily's training in crisis management served her well. "Everything's fine," she said smoothly, checking Stephanie's chart and maintaining the professional demeanor that had carried her through medical school and residency. "Let's finish the discharge process." She reviewed medication schedules, provided physical therapy recommendations, and scheduled follow-up appointments with the efficient competence that her colleagues had come to expect. But underneath her professional calm, Emily was calculating exit strategies and wondering how quickly she could complete her responsibilities and leave. When the discharge paperwork was finally completed and the other medical staff had left, Wyatt made the request Emily had been dreading. "Dr. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying a tone of careful respect that Emily had never heard from him before. "Could we have a word with you in private?" Emily nodded, though every instinct told her to decline and walk away. But curiosity and a lifetime of confronting difficult situations kept her rooted in place as the room emptied of everyone except the three people who had shared a house for 18 years without ever truly becoming a family. The moment the door closed, Wyatt's entire demeanor transformed. The careful deference he had shown to Dr. Patterson was replaced by something Emily had never experienced from him: genuine pride and enthusiasm. "Emily, sweetheart, I can't believe it's really you," he said, his voice filled with an emotion that sounded almost like joy. "Look at what you've accomplished. A surgeon. And not just any surgeon, the surgeon who saved your mother's life. We're so proud of you, honey. So incredibly proud." Stephanie was crying now, her post-surgical weakness making her emotions even more raw. "I missed you so much, Emily. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you and wonder how you were doing. And now you're a doctor, just like you always dreamed. I can't believe our little girl became such an amazing woman." Emily listened to their words with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. These were the same people who had called her dreams nonsense, who had threatened to disown her for wanting an education, who had chosen the cleaning business over their daughter's potential. Now they were claiming pride in accomplishments they had done everything possible to prevent. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice carrying the calm authority she used when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients. "Are you the same people who told me that college was a waste of money? The same people who said that if I pursued my dreams, I could never come home again?" The question hung in the air like a surgical instrument, precise and cutting. Wyatt was the first to attempt an explanation. "Emily, honey, you have to understand we were struggling so much back then. We were scared. And we didn't think. We didn't believe you could actually succeed at something so difficult. We were trying to protect you from disappointment." Stephanie nodded eagerly. "We were wrong, sweetheart. So terribly wrong. But this shouldn't be how parents and children live, separated by old misunderstandings. You're our daughter, and we love you, and we want to celebrate what you've accomplished." That's when the door opened, and Rick walked into the room with the quiet confidence that had characterized every crisis Emily had ever seen him handle. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing Wyatt and Stephanie with polite firmness, "but I think there's been some confusion about your relationship with Emily." He turned to Emily with the gentle smile that had been her anchor through every storm of the past 14 years. Emily, I'd like you to meet Wyatt and Stephanie Dawson, your former adoptive parents. The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Emily felt the world tilt around her as Rick's words rearranged everything she thought she knew about her identity and her family history. Rick continued speaking, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining complex situations. When I first met Emily, I couldn't understand how parents could be so cruel to their own child. It didn't make sense to me that people would work so hard to destroy their daughter's dreams. So I did some investigating old habits from my military days. He pulled out a folder Emily hadn't noticed him carrying. Emily was adopted by the Dawsons when she was 6 months old. Her biological mother was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell who died during childbirth. Emily's adoption was handled through the state system, and the Dawsons received monthly support payments for taking care of her. Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank into the chair beside Stephanie's wheelchair. Everything suddenly made terrible sense why she had always felt like an outsider in her own family, why her dreams had been treated as betrayals, why her parents had been so quick to cast her out when she refused to remain their unpaid employee. The monthly payments stopped when Emily turned 18, Rick continued, which is probably why they were so insistent that she stay home and work for the family business instead of going to college. Wyatt's face had gone red with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. That's not. It wasn't about the money. We loved Emily. We raised her. Rick's expression remained neutral, but Emily could see the controlled anger in his eyes. You used her. First for the financial support her placement provided, then as free labor for your cleaning business. When she wanted to pursue her own dreams, you threatened to disown her rather than lose your unpaid worker. The truth settled over the room like dust after an explosion, leaving everyone stunned and struggling to process the implications of what had been revealed. Emily stared at the people she had called her parents for 18 years, finally understanding why love had always felt conditional in their house, why her achievements had been dismissed, why her brothers had been encouraged while she had been relegated to servant status. Stephanie was crying harder now, her tears a mixture of grief and what looked like genuine regret. Emily, please let us explain. Please don't leave like this. We can work this out as a family. But Emily was already standing up, her professional composure cracking under the weight of 14 years' worth of suppressed emotions and the shocking revelation of her true origins. She left Wyatt and Stephanie in the hospital room, their pleas following her down the hallway as she walked rapidly toward the exit. Rick followed silently, giving her the space to process what she had learned, while remaining close enough to provide support if she needed it. At home, Emily sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life she had built. Michael's medical journals on the counter, Johnny's toys scattered across the floor, family photos showing the people who had actually loved and supported her dreams. But all she could think about was the woman who had died bringing her into the world, and the elaborate deception that had shaped her entire childhood. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked Rick when she finally trusted herself to speak without breaking down completely. Rick sat across from her at the kitchen table, where they had shared so many conversations over the years. "I thought about it many times," he admitted, "but I wasn't sure if knowing would help you or hurt you. You were working so hard to build your new life, and I didn't want to distract you from your studies with family drama." He paused, his weathered hands folded on the table between them. "But there was another reason I waited. Your biological mother, Sarah Mitchell, she was a remarkable young woman, worked 2 jobs to support herself through nursing school, planned to become a pediatric nurse. She died giving birth to you, but according to the records I found, she spent her pregnancy writing letters to you, planning for your future, dreaming about the life you'd have together." Emily felt tears she had been holding back for hours finally beginning to fall. "What happened to the letters? They were supposed to be given to you when you turned 18, but the Dawsons never mentioned them. They're probably stored somewhere with your adoption papers." Rick reached across the table to cover Emily's hands with his own. "She wanted you to know that you were loved before you even took your first breath, that you came from someone who believed in education and dreams and possibilities." The image of a young woman writing letters to a daughter she would never meet was almost too painful to bear. But it also explained something Emily had never understood: where her drive and ambition had come from. Why she had always felt like there was something more she was meant to do with her life. A few days later, Emily and Rick were sitting on their front porch, watching Johnny play in the yard while Michael grilled dinner on the barbecue. The domestic tranquility felt surreal after the emotional earthquake of the hospital encounter, but Emily was beginning to process what she had learned and what it meant for her future. "Rick," she said finally, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Rick looked up from the newspaper he was reading, his expression attentive but relaxed. "Are you even real?" Emily asked, her tone only half joking. "I mean, are you actually a human being? Or are you some kind of angel who was sent to save me when I needed saving most?" Rick was quiet for a long moment, and Emily could see him considering his answer with the same careful attention he brought to all important questions. Then his face broke into the mischievous grin that had been entertaining her for 14 years. "Well," he said, settling back in his chair with the timing of a natural storyteller, "there was this one time when I was fishing at Lake Morrison. You remember that spot with the fallen log where the bass like to hide? Anyway, I was having the worst luck, hadn't caught anything all morning, and I was starting to think the fish had all packed up and moved to Florida." Emily found herself smiling despite everything she had been through in recent days. Rick's stories always had this effect on her, creating a bubble of normalcy and joy that made even the most serious problems feel manageable. "So I'm sitting there," Rick continued, "feeling sorry for myself and wondering if I should just give up fishing entirely when this old pelican lands right next to my boat. Just sits there staring at me like I'm the most pathetic fisherman he's ever seen." Emily was already beginning to laugh, anticipating one of Rick's perfectly timed punchlines. "And this pelican, I swear this is true, looks me right in the eye and says, 'Rick, the problem isn't that you're a bad fisherman. The problem is that you're fishing in the wrong place. Angels don't need fishing licenses, but they do need to learn proper bait selection." Emily burst into laughter, the sound carrying across their yard and mixing with Johnny's giggles and Michael's humming from the barbecue. It was the first genuine laughter she had experienced since learning the truth about her adoption, and it felt like medicine for wounds she hadn't even known she was carrying. "So to answer your question," Rick concluded with perfect comedic timing, "I'm definitely human, but I might have received some very good advice about where to cast my line when I was looking for someone to share my stories with." As the sun set behind their house, Emily realized that the truth about her origins didn't change the most important facts of her life. She had found her real family in the most unexpected places, had built a career that allowed her to heal people and save lives, and had created the kind of loving home she had always dreamed of having. The injustices of her childhood had been revealed and understood, but more importantly, they had been overcome through the love and support of people who chose to value her for who she was, rather than what she could do for them. Justice, Emily realized, wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about building a life so full of love and purpose that the people who had tried to limit you became irrelevant to your happiness. And as she watched Rick teach Johnny how to identify the evening birds that were settling in their oak trees, Emily knew that sometimes the best response to those who refuse to believe in your dreams is simply to live those dreams so fully that their doubt becomes nothing more than background noise to your success.